Hi, this is Empire of the Mind, a podcast about our universal civilization. I'm Dr. Bruce Gilley. You may be wondering how to make sense of contemporary events in places like Hong Kong, South Africa, or Haiti. Well, this podcast is the place for you. We'll deconstruct some of these problems in terms of their encounter with colonialism, what's happened with their anti-colonial movements, and how decolonization has had unintended consequences. We'll bring in speakers, we'll cover events, we'll look at the decolonized movement in the West, whatever that means, and we'll try and make sense of the long historical arc through which the universal civilization that came with European colonialism but then escaped from it, has continued to shape our world. For this podcast, I'd like to unpack that term, universal civilization. Of course, I didn't make that up. Who made that up? V.S. Naipaul, the Nobel laureate, and for my money, the greatest ever author in fiction and nonfiction about the challenges of the Third World. Naipaul in 1990 gave a talk at the Manhattan Institute in New York called Our Universal Civilization. And in it, he described his own personal journey from a parochial, marginalized Hindu community living in Trinidad to Britain, where he became a writer and where he discovered the liberal tradition of openness, toleration, the equality of individuals, that universal civilization that he found was the best guarantee of human flourishing everywhere. For Naipaul, universal civilization was not the same as Western civilization, but Western civilization had been the beginnings of it. Now it had spread widely. It could make the most of every culture. It was accessible to all. It was good for all. It was something that anti-colonialism, which was in some sense a rejection of universal civilization, was constantly struggling against. Here he is, talking to Charlie Rose in 1994 on the question of colonialism's legacies.
What is the legacy in your judgment of colonialism?
And very good legacy. Very, very good. I think a country like India has benefited enormously, and it would be churlish and foolish and inaccurate for any Indian to deny it. Through the British conquest, India developed new learning. It was also granted a great period of peace, which it hadn't had for centuries before, with the Muslim conquest and invasions of India. India was trampled over ceaselessly. And with the British conquest, for the first time, you have ideas of human rights coming in, ideas of institution, courts, law. Before that, everything belonged to the ruler.
Not very popular sentiments, as you can imagine. Naipaul, of course, has been assailed by the critics of the academy and the literary establishment as an imperial apologist, as a self-hating Indian, you know. But for my money, his insights help us to explain the world better than any other writer who took on an anti-colonial or post-colonial perspective. Naipaul was the embodiment of universal civilization, and this podcast, Empire of the Mind, will center on that fundamental question of universal civilization and its alternatives.